very happy to have Ulf Mellström here, and he also has extensive work with gender and from a quite different perspective from the many of us others. In transport and mobility, we start with the women's issues because this is what politicians want to pay for, but sometimes we also need to come from another angle, and I hope you can help us to understand a little bit more about both genders, men and women. Yeah, thank you to be here.
Thank you, Lena.
Thank you.
Tack så mycket. Thanks a lot for inviting me, and nice to be here. As I said, I work in gender studies, and although I'm in sort of background in anthropology, so I wrote a PhD once upon a time, almost 20 years ago, on Volvo and engineers at Volvo, and then I came into actually masculinity studies because I realized at the time there was a lot of men in Volvo design. There was the design of the 850 car model, and so maybe it has something to do with masculinity, I thought. Okay. And so after that was a sort of a key question, and a lot of my academic career what I've been doing is basically writing about technology and masculinity and the connection and the intimate connection. And I also partly what I'll be talking about today, men's love and passion for technology, and in particular now with you as an audience, cars, motorcycles and so. But that's so I've written books like Men and Their Machines, Men, Power, Technology and Masculinity. I've been working in India, Malaysia, Sweden, Brazil, a number of different countries on these issues. But I've been doing a number of other things as well, but sort of my academic career is very much devoted to studying masculinity. And what I've written in this area with regard to transport studies and mobility is also with my friend and colleague who many of you know, Dag Balkmar, who presented at the first workshop, and he presented a joint article of ours, which I will just talk a little about, but was published in Transfers now, and which is on masculinity and automated vehicles, and basically with the question, who is in the driver's seat as there's no drivers? What happens with masculinity when automated vehicles? Anyway, I'll start off a bit, as I said, a bit esoteric, a bit theoretical, but I'll become more concrete, and hopefully something what I say will be applicable also to you as working with these important issues, sometimes more practically. And what I'm working with now is what I've sort of post-humanism. I don't know how familiar you are with the sort of idea or theory tradition of post-humanism. It's a large umbrella, but it's looming around binaries, I would say, like nature, culture, human, non-human, the machinic, the somatic, the materiality, organic, these binaries. And if we look at masculinity studies, there are a few texts that take an explicit point in what we talk about as post-humanist studies or new materialism. And there's even fewer texts that take sort of have the combination of masculinity and transport and mobility, although I think it would be a sort of a fruitful kind of connection to theorize mobility and masculinity and gender in general, I think, with regard to from a post-humanist perspective. And generally within the field of what they talk about as feminist new materialism, there are very few texts that explicitly problematize masculinity in terms of ontology or ontological terms, and have masculinity as a focus in their writings. So, which is something I do at the moment, sort of to map text which has to do with masculinity, transport, mobility. From a post-humanist perspective, it's quite a manageable task and not that much work. But if we sort of extend that assignment to think about the question of how man, the question of man as human, is entangled with nature, culture, materiality, corporality, in knowledge production, it's not. It's sort of it's the grand question. So, and here we're rather cutting to how, I would say, masculinity is the gender of no gender, or the normative node, what it means to be human. It means, or has traditionally meant what it means to be human, or how the social sciences uncritically have presumed a masculine subject when examining human conditions, or how a knowledgeable subject in our fields has been presumed and been even required to be a man, but in science as well as in politics. So this is, of course, then, to me, sort of a key to what we could talk about as ontological politics and epistemological practices of many forms of new materialisms. And that's very the idea to sort of displace human, read man, exceptionalism. To displace the central role of man and to descend to the masculine subject as such. Note, this is not to displace men, which is often, but to the very idea of putting man at the center, and that's the and sort of the corporal and the ethics of this takes us then to the entanglement, the intimacies, the dependence upon nature, culture, and materiality. And that is symmetric relation rather than an asymmetric relation, which is sort of a key to understanding or thinking around materialism or new materialism. So, and if we, as a starting point, take for example how masculine identity has been connected to materiality and the very idea of being a man or being human. I think possibly the best, or the best metaphor that I work or we possibly can find is no doubt the cyborg. And I think for the purpose of this presentation and generally for much of my work, it's a sort of an encompassing term that for a self-regulating system that combines the organic and the artificial, the machinic and the non-machinic. Although the term itself originates from an article from 1960 by Manfred Klein, who was a musician, he was a world-class musician, as well as the psychiatrist and expert on psychedelic drugs, Nathan Klein, where they were melding these two, the cybernetic and the organic. And sort of that conceptualization has been paramount of the fusion between human-machine, man-machine. And of course, talking about the cyborg is of course just as non-specific or as talking about a machine or a tool, but I think it's just as important to kind of portray a politics of how we think around our bodies in both historical accounts as well as portraying our contemporary zeitgeist. And Chris Habels-Gray, who's a prolific cyborg theorist, he talks about, well, cyborgs were dreams long before they were even machines. The very idea, and I would say that sort of the cyborgic idea is a sort of kind of leitmotif which runs through the history of religion, art, science, technology in the Western world as well as in the non-Western world. And a crucial drive here is sort of the male desire for transcendence. And the desire for transcendence or of transcendence has been invested and nurtured through religious, mythological, as well as technical fantasy creatures, such as automatons, golems, robots, and a number of in sci-fi films. And so you could probably think of a number of sort of these cyborgic creatures. And a sort of a characteristic of these creatures and artifacts has always been their prosthetic capacity, with an inherent Janus face, Janus ansikte på svenska, which means that it's either so it points in two directions, sort of a destructiveness or sort of emancipatory hopes through transcendence, or hopes of transcendence through cyborgisation. So cyborgs are then political technologies, and they're also very ambivalent creatures. And the Janus phase of such political technologies are, for instance, outlined in the work of Donna Haraway, just to sort of illustrate what I mean with the Janus phase. From one perspective, a cyborg word is about the final imposition of a grid of control on the planet, about the final abstraction embodied in Star Wars apocalypse waged in the name of defense. And this was a time when she wrote that, when the idea of defense, or what Star Wars defense for the US was something which were part of the defense policy in the US. But from another perspective, a cyborg word might be about the lived and social and bodily realities in which people are not afraid of their joint kinship with animals and machines, not afraid of the permanently partial identities and contradictory standpoints. The political struggle is to see from both perspectives at once. And this may seem a bit esoteric, but I promise eventually I'll try to be much more empirical. And Donna Haraway's sort of symbolic appropriation of the concept of cyborg, which she sort of crystallized in her 1985 article, Cyborg Manifesto, where she talks about, I'd rather be a cyborg than a goddess, where she's in many ways a turning point in gender studies, and also a feminist intervention into a conceptual and experiential world, which until then had very much been totally dominated by male bodies and the male discursive space. Although Donna Haraway, she would nonetheless, she's very critical about the term post-human. If you read one of her last books of 2016, Stay with the Trouble, I mean, she's quite critical, but I think she nonetheless sort of opened up here an emancipatory space for post-human understanding of what we talk about. It's sort of technological intimacy and entanglement and reciprocity and proximity and our affinity with technologies and materialities that has become a sort of a key in thinking around materiality in contemporary critical post-humanism and new materialism. And this, what Karen Berard talked about as this ethico-onto-epistemological, long word, this ethico-onto-epistemological grounding of new materialism is now slowly also moving into masculinity studies. Whether it's moving into transport and mobility studies is possibly more debatable, but I'll try to actually mention a few work which I think can be categorized in transport and mobility studies in this sort of theoretical vein, and with the risk of partly repeating what my friend and colleague Dag Balkmar has talked about, but as we move into or as car-intensive societies move into an era where you are key persons in that, in the area of need of sustainable mobility, there are so many pressing political concerns, as you were addressing, Joachim, that need to be addressed. One of those is, of course, the strong connection between masculinity, power, and car cultures. That's and as we start to challenge, which I actually think we do now in many different ways, that deep-rooted connection between cars and masculinity, we're also questioning a sort of economy or gendered economy, or what Sara Ahmed would talk about as a sort of effective economy, based on control, speed, sexuality, and embodiment. I think this is definitely sort of an underrated dimension in transport and mobility studies. How we feel about the materiality, how we feel in sort of that effective economy as a sort of a strong drive for different forms of project. And in the introduction of a recent special issue, which is called Degendering the Driver, Autonomous Driving and the Transformation of Car Cultures in the journal Transfers, where the guest editors Jutta Weber and Fabian Kröger. I don't know if anyone of you are familiar with that. They in the introduction they write, and here also the reference to the article that probably Dag talked about last year, but which now is published. So they say the concept of the driverless car that may or may not hit the road in some years differ considerably. But the common point is in all cases that the promise of safer and more efficient self-driving cars made by commercial players resonated by the journalistic and popular culture discourse prolongs the old logics of a technological fix. Technology is mainly understood as a tool instead of the embodiment of social relations and a common product of human and non-human practices and actors. Accordingly, the dominant discourse tries to solve problems of contemporary road transportation systems in a top-down and instrumental way, leaving central social and cultural issues of post-Fordist mobility unattended. And in many ways, to me, this was sort of a key of understanding the gender and automobility in our current time. Sort of that. And for me, this is a sort of, you could talk about this as a sort of a post-humanist understanding of the transport system and mobility as such. Where we sort of displace what usually has been in the center, and we sort of see ourselves as sort of integrated in the system. Of course, this is, but I think, and what you, and what you do, I think, in your daily practices is very much exactly this, and thinking new around how we transport, mobility, transport practices, planning. And as many has, and now I talk a bit more about my own work over the years, which is, gender and technology, masculinity and technology. As many has emphasized, the pleasure of driving fast is more than the sort of the functionality of the transport, but also the interaction with an object and what an object can do that sort of interaction, that embodied interaction. And that in itself points to multi-layered pleasures of speed as an almost mystical experience, a competition in overcoming the natural and machinic forces in interaction with the vehicle. I'm sure many of you have had that experience. Is anyone driving a motorcycle? Anyone? No? Cabriolet. Yeah. But when we look at driving practices, is, as many have pointed out, to be seen in that sort of material semiotic assemblage, or networks of an actors that consist of humans and non-humans as well. And has been consistently argued in, for example, science and technology studies for many years, the interaction between subject and object are by no means detachable, but is to be seen as a number of very concrete practices. And within that, you can see that it's sort of critical branch within science and technology studies, which is feminist technology studies, have since the late 1970s shown how such processes of intimate and constitutive interaction are also gendered. The gendering of cars, driving, speed, and more generally what we possibly could talk about as a gendered sociology of transport and mobility is now areas that seems to receive much more attention after many years of neglect, I would say, in social analysis. And I guess this conference and your workshop and this network is a perfect example of that, addressing that lacuna that you were talking about, Hilde, and the complexity of that, as you were talking about, Joachim, which is, I think, it's very important. And here we have a number. We have cultural studies, or from my sort of take on this, of course, masculinity, feminist technology studies, culture studies, among others, who contribute to wider understanding of how gender and technology is co-produced, or more specifically, for my concern, the sort of the cultural masculinizations of mobility and cars in general. So I guess by taking seriously, and I guess my point here is by taking seriously how people feel about and how they feel in cars, and how the feel of different car cultures elicits specific dispositions and different ways of life, we will also be in a better position to evaluate and reevaluate ethical dimensions of car consumptions, as well as the moral economies of car use. I think only then can we consider what will be really necessary to make the transition from today's car cultures to a more socially and environmentally responsible transportation culture, or cultures. I don't know, but of course that's the grounding for at least for my grounding from being this field. And how long can I talk to? 3:30?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. But as part of such a larger project, I have for many years sort of addressed that feel, that intimate connection, that love and passion for with regard to masculinity and technology. Where I've studied engineers at Volvo. I've spent 1.5 years among motor mechanics in the Chinese diaspora of Penang, Malaysia, hanging out in motor workshops. And I've also, now when I work in Värmland, I have spent a lot of time with the raggare, which is greasers, and they're trying to understand their passion for sort of the technology and cars, and well, basically riding around in the cars and talking to them, which is probably. And as I said, I'm an anthropologist, so that's what we do. We hang out with people for long periods of time, trying to understand sort of the logics of everyday life. Why do people do what they do? And what motivates them to get up from bed in the morning? Which I think is sort of a key question. What motivates you to get out of bed in the morning? And I have, this is something I've addressed. And I will just sort of then try, before I end, to draw a few lines of thought around what we possibly could talk about as sort of an anthropology of transport emotions. Or Katarina Landström talked about as a gendered economy of speed, pleasure, and embodiment. And among the wide range of emotional expressions in a gendered economy or an anthropology of transport emotions, we could sort out three overarching ones: love, passion, and friendship. And in the words of the cultural theorist Paul Virilio, which of course, I don't know, many of you work. Oh, sorry. Well, I thought I was. Also, one. Anyway, I think I need to. Anyway, I can, just say something about this. Baudrillard. Travel is a necessity, speed is a pleasure. Movement alone is the basis of a sort of happiness, but mechanical euphoria associated with something else together grounded for the imagination and the miracle of motion. Effortless mobility entails a kind of pleasure that is unrealistic, a kind of suspension of existence, a kind of absence of responsibility. Paul Virilio talks about speed is not a phenomenon, it's a relation B phenomenon. Jeremy Clarkson, who many of you know from Top Gear, I guess, he used to be the head of Top Gear. Anyone watch Top Gear? No. So he talks about speed in itself, it's not exciting. As you sit in a Boeing, are you thrilled? Are you thrilled that it's ripping up the sky with 500 mph auger off of big numbers? No, it's the same deal in a straight line on a straight road in a car, 200 mph. So what? What matters is acceleration and handling and ability to take corners as though they were not there. And that's why the Ferrari, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. So, what do you see? Theorizing of speed can be done at sort of... done in regard to different audiences and different levels of sophistication, you could say. But to me, it's expressing similar lines of strands of thought in that they emphasize a close, intertwined, and pleasurable relation between humans, object, subject-object, human-machine, and so forth. It seems that those forms of both mundane and sophisticated philosophical theorizing are very common and may possibly speak about a wide and deep fascination with speed cars as an intense and powerful human experience that takes on a variety of forms takes a variety of forms in people's everyday lives in our contemporary societies. Some years ago, a well-known Swedish columnist, krönikör, Ludwig Rasmussen, never received so many responses when he wrote, "On Saturdays, the men are standing outside their houses and polish their cars with chamois leather. Det är sämsk skinn på svenska. And they caress them carefully and with the tender love their wives haven't experienced for many years. Which of course is a kind of intimate relation. In this rather, I mean, he always wrote, he's not writing any columns anymore, but in this humorous and thought-provoking column, Rasmussen further claims that men are not fully men unless they are together with their cars, and characterizes men, especially middle-aged men, as autotars, which is then, you know, centaurs and autotars. And with the torso of a man and the body and legs of a horse, that's a centaur. An autotar's body and legs consist of wheels and engine firmly seated in the chassis of the car. On a more theoretical level, my dear colleague Dag Balkmar and his former colleague and our former colleague Tanja Joelsson suggest and develop the figuration of the bionic man, for how to understand cars and other mobile vehicles as extensions of the male body. And of course that's not something new, but I think they also introduced an article actually in a very good journal called Norma, for which I'm the editor. It's an extremely it's called Norma, International Journal for Masculinity Studies, and it's very but anyway, they Dag and Tanja, they wrote this in, I think that was 2012, they published this piece where they also introduced the concept of auto-eroticism, which is sort of that, to describe the passion and love. That, of course, not only men, but I'm talking about men, and just let me say, of course, women can have exact the same kind of passion, love, and friendship with materiality and cars, of course. But historically, women has not been allowed to have that. But they also argue in that article that these emotional aspects of driving cars and riding mopeds needs to be regarded as both vital and crucial aspects when we study men's risk-taking in traffic space, for example, which is, you know, sort of a key to understanding. And as you all know, the overrepresentation of men, and especially young men, when it comes to risk-taking traffic, is enormous. It's another project I actually started up now in Värmland, where we look at suicides and masculinity. Men do, I mean, because we have a large overrepresentation when it comes to suicides and men. It's depending on where we look, it's men take their life up to, I mean, from all in Sweden, 70 to 75%, depending on where, people who take their lives is men. And it's in certain age categories. It's young, it's men between 50 and 55, and it's old men. In Sweden, riksgenomsnitt, the average for Sweden is 50 to 54. That's, you have a peak. But in certain counties, like rural counties like Värmland or up north, you also have a peak for old men. So it's and a short peak around 20 also. So. And anyway, and the question we're working with, how many of the traffic accidents are actually suicides when it comes to men? We have no idea, and of course it's hard to, how could we even find out? But we do definitely suspect, I mean, there's quite a huge number of suicides where young men or old men or men of any age drive into a bridge, or, you know, that's the way they take their lives. So this is, yeah, it's apparently something where masculinity is sort of a crucial factor in when also with regard to traffic. But I don't know if you have any statistics that could help us. I would appreciate that. And how can you even, you can't, well, obviously, ask people who've taken their lives.
There were some, I think, research about this in traffic safety research.
Oh, okay.
And there are some methods I think the police use to filter out. It's not, we can't focus all of this, but some have some. There was something I can help you to find.
That would be great. Yeah.
Later. Yes.
We have special investigators for this. So there are a
You
couple of guys that I know that do all these investigations after these.
I think you have
also. It would be extremely helpful. That would be very, very helpful. Now that's really, because we just started up this project and we see, there's quite a grey zone here, because it's all, of suicides, you have safe or, claimed suicides, which are, this has been, but then you have the grey zone, and especially when it comes to driving, that's enormous grey zone. But yeah, that would be great. Yeah. Well, anyway, I'll say a bit more about my previous work, but it's my previous work has generally led me to understand the connection between technology and masculinity, and then you can apply that to the transport sector as well as its kind of two-sidedness, the power and the pleasure. So I believe it's important to understand men's relationship with machines, and not only as a story about power and control and mastering, which is often the sort of a bit stereotypical idea of men. They want to master technology because they want a power control, but also as a story about pleasures and joys in artifacts. That sensuous relation between man and machine. And I also believe and that this sort of two-sided analytic framework is crucial to understanding the complexity of power resources in relation to technology. And that relates to the balance between power enforcement by state bodies, motor organizations, and power enactments by individuals, such as reckless driving, violent and aggressive motoring. But these stories, which we have a lot of, also needs to be combined with stories of that embodied range of emotions that are connecting to what we talk about, the interpolating experiences of driving a car, a motorcycle, or other vehicles. In a similar line of thought, I have argued elsewhere, I believe it's impossible to understand, for example, large-scale transport engineering projects such as highways or bridges, with also understanding the undercurrent passion of sociality, pleasure involved in such projects. And central actors in such projects has been historically and still to overwhelmingly it has been men of power that are often in love with the technology and have that sort of affectionate passion and mission, but dressed in a language of rational thought and sort of and instrumentalism, because they would never, of course, many would never confess their sort of that love and passion, but I never did. For example, Bruno Latour in his works on the train Aramis pointed to the role of love and affectionate attachments for the successful outcome of technological projects. And we can look at a number of Swedish studies, for example, the project management of Volvo's XC90 model, which what Annika Bragg has written about. And she talks about the importance of emotional involvement and how the master story, as well as the sort of the day-to-day, the mundane stories of the project management and development process and the design of the XC90 are stories of hard work, heroic men, and rational thought.
What is particular about this model car?
Now,
We don't know, or
You don't have you don't have Volvo? It's a SUV, but you know, I wouldn't say it's a particular sort of the development process and the design of the XC90, but I think it was one of Volvo's first SUVs, so it's a kind of prestige project in that sense. But I mean, I think this could apply to many sort of large-scale engineering projects.
It's expensive.
Yeah, it's very expensive. Yeah.
That's why it is so it's a status.
Yeah. No, definitely. Yeah. So I think but that kind of range of emotions is involved in those projects. It's something that needs to be estimated as well, and of course I'll just take a few more examples on. I mean, you can see that both as a sort of in a large scale engineering project, but you can also see that with regard to very common, ordinary, if you want, men on the Swedish countryside. I once interviewed Johan, who's an engineer and hobby mechanic living in Strålsnäs on the plains of Östergötland, and where he describes his beloved Chevrolet Corvette Stingray. He describes it as a woman laying her aside with her flesh located on the right spots. When Johan describes his relation with her, he says, "I'm still trying to get to know her. She has been mine only for 4 years. I think we need another 5 years at least before we really know each other." And of course, Johan has dismantled her into separate parts. Every single screw and bolt has been scrutinized. It sometimes happens that he's sitting in front of her and purely for enjoyment. He's obviously in love, and the car was the fulfillment of a dream nourished and nurtured for many years. The sound of the Corvette 375 horsepower is like a wonderful it's like wonderful music to Johan, and the feeling of driving alone in the car is just as joyful. Johan is passionate about this material thing, and this passion of the car assumes the shapes of a beautiful woman. As you know, the language of love is rarely sexless, nor is the case here. This is, of course, and since Johan has dismantled his Corvette piece by piece, he knows the machine intimately from the inside. He's absorbed and taken by her, and she has become an extension of him. Or at least that's the way he describes it. The way he and other men describes their machines, that works in a similar fashion as they describe other personal intersexual relationships. In other words, it seems to reflect an experience and characteristics of lives lived within the frame of a normative heterosexuality. An underlying desire, which of course is to be held and taken by the machine, is commonly expressed incorporating the sensual pleasures of joys and interacting with technology. And I have a few more examples, but I'll just take this last one to illustrate, how this has always been incorporated into a sort of a normative heterosexuality. But now, as a dog has partly written about in a beautiful article, how we in a moment of actually queering and degendering that normative heterosexuality, also with regard to machines, which I think is an interesting sort of development, which will happen in the next maybe 5 to 10 years, and which you guys will be part of, I hope, in one way or another. So, yeah, I think I've sort of over my time, so I'll probably stop here. But I've got a number of different examples for how this passionate, and I guess my point is basically we need to take in this passionate relation, the love and passion, our affections for technology, in regard to also planning and different sort of large-scale planning projects. And I would, from my sort of perspective of sort of post-humanist theorizing, I would also place that under the umbrella of thinking with regard to new materialism, post-humanism. I don't know if you want to do that, but much of what I guess you do in your work, I would sort of frame that. Yeah, okay?
Questions for Ulf? Yes, Hilda.
I've got two small and big questions. One is when you end here saying that the feelings should enter the field, I would pose a counter question. Aren't there too many feelings implied in, I mean, smart mobility, all this cost, all the money goes there without testing?
Oh, yeah.
Shouldn't we attack that in a way? That's one question. And another question is more theoretical. You call you use the headline post-humanist. Why that? Because it seems to me as if you draw on. You are very eclectic in a way in your work.
Yeah.
So why do you use this particular headline?
I think the first question would be sort of why it's so much invested in sort of smart mobilities is probably because there's so much passion involved in there as well. And what we which is I didn't came that far, but and here you often have the reversed relation between if we're talking about binary gender, men and women, where women are the sort of the rational and the sort of where men are the passionate, and where their passion could, and of course where it also sits with a lot of power resources and could use that for while investing in that passion. I think that's a very crude, but of course I think it's you could think around that with regard to. And there's a few, Line Holt in her PhD who written about that, Katarina Landström who writes about that, for example, when it comes to buying a new car. She has gone through British motor magazines, how the men are, they've described the cars with all these language of love and passion and sexuality, and the women just say, we need something to take us from point B to point A to point B. So, I mean, there's a reversed relation between, historically, if you compare it to, well, if in feminist theorizing and we've been criticizing for such a long time, the Cartesian dichotomy between rational, irrational, soft, hard, and here we have the reversed relation, which I think is really interesting. And the post-humanist is, I think it's a good umbrella, and for me it's sort of what I was trying to say in the beginning was sort of decentering the very idea of man, which I think is sort of, and the human exceptionalism, which I think it's a good, but if you could convince me with another sort of term, I would easily go for that. But for me, that works, and I think cyborg is also a very good sort of metaphor for thinking around our entanglement and proximity and close connection to. And I think transport is probably is exemplary. Talk about the system of human and non-human actors, which is and think around that, which I think is sort of. And I never got to the blindgänger. No. That's another. But that's.
Say something about the blindgänger.
The blindgänger is, well, you Germans, of course, you know that it's a German word, and you don't find it. You don't have the. In Swedish, you have blindgångare, which is blindgänger, but there's no English word for it. English is quite a poor language sometimes when it comes to. Because and especially the Germanic, especially when you can put words together, I think there's, much better in getting out a sort of a well, anyway, that's another. But the blindgänger is the sort of because in feminist new materialism and in new materialism, post-humanism, you have this all emancipatory hopes, which starts with John Haraway's, of our entanglement of nature, culture, technology, materiality as something inherently good. But if you look into the history of masculinity and the fusion between men and machines, technology and materiality, you have quite a sad story of destructiveness, war, cyborgic soldiers. Ernst Junger writes about that in the trenches of the World War I, where the men explode in battle with their weapons, and so it's quite it's a very sad story. So that's the blindgänger. Or no?
More questions? Yes.
I think what you give is quite fascinating, especially coming from the other side. That said, isn't that the feeling itself, it's something that's actually created by the companies to create money, in the sense that if you're actually going back to transport planning, why we actually end up like this, because in 50s and 60s people think that it was a good idea to have a zoning system. Nobody think about this really motorized driven city at the time. Even in Stockholm, they want to bulldoze the city because they think that that's a good idea. Then since it has been reinforced by the car manufacturing industry that it is actually driving is actually good, there is attachment of feeling and so on. So when we actually start building a city, those feelings are actually not there. Then when you actually start to think then how we can actually solve the problem, it depends how you actually as people. If you as elderly, they want to have everything accessible within a distance. If you ask people in productive age, they want to actually have a distance from their working place. If you ask in 80 years old, they want to actually have a Wi-Fi POS in every single corner of the street. So what I'm trying to say is that the feeling and the patience about this, isn't that it's something that's not really driven by the planner, but it's much more kind of economic interest behind it?
Yeah, well, I don't know if I'm the right person, but I think it's really interesting to make that sort of economic analysis, not least in terms of now how we can sort of well, not manipulate effect, but it's how emotional times we're in, and what are driving sort of what is channeling desire, emotions, effect in our societies. I think that, especially with social media, I think it's a really interesting question. But I think there was a really good research question in there. It's a lot of look at what kind of passions drove certain periods of time and certain technological projects, and how do they differ at different historical periods of time. And definitely, of course, there's an economic incentive there, which is enormous, of course. That's, I don't know.
Because, at least for me, if I just may add a little bit, if I see from the economic perspective, it is very normal for the governments to support this technology because, like Sweden or Germany, we depend on Volvo and Scania and Volkswagen for our pension.
True.
So then, like it or not, this is what the government tried to do.
And I know there's this wonderful about the love and passion written by some social scientist, but it's published by BMW on of course it's a sensuous relation to driving a BMW, but it's based on sort of real research. It's good mobility scholars, British mobility scholars, who've written that it's I can't remember, but you know, that's probably one of the best reports I've read about the sensuous and that passion of, especially with, of course, and that's branding. Of course, that also goes with the BMW. Driving a BMW is something extra than driving a Volvo.
Quality also, quality, and as I said before, the Volvo is expensive, and it makes you more powerful when you have this car. Instead of a small second-hand Fiat. Can we have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick on Yusuf's comment about this the regime shift and how something becomes very attractive. Now, what's happening, at least I can quote the case of Norway, I think what's happening all around the world, is there's a regime shift towards focus on bicycling, and suddenly you will find men on their Saturday and Sunday mornings washing their bicycling with equal pleasure, and having the right clothes, the right gears while they cycle. And this is, I think it's called the condom dress, the dress which they put on, and because there's a regime shift and there's a focus on cycling suddenly now, even in developing countries, it's no more the poor man's mode. I mean, the middle class, high-income group is donning the right attire for cycling, and the passion is shifting. So I guess it is very much interlinked with advertisement, with focus, with how you capture imagination. And from the engineering domain, we really don't have the tools to comment on how we capture imagination. But as humans, we respond to it. And women, in the sense, they are more rational in this because it is a mode of transport. It doesn't really cross beyond it. But for men, it is more than that. I mean, there's something between technology and men which is so closely interlinked. But it has the potential to shift from car to bicycle. It has that potential.
But then I think it's really interesting when you were talking about the global south and developing countries, because, I mean, just go to Benares or Bangalore or Pune or...
It's changing like
but it's still, you know, go by bicycle in Bangalore is...
No, but that's because the regime has not shifted its stand. The regime is still focused on cars.
Very much so.
So what is happening, bicycling is a grounded kind of uprising. But the government is focused on car there, so that the shift has not happened. You know, so but if that shift happens, the uptake is huge. We are talking trillions of bicycling. Something which probably has happened in China and which.
That's a really interesting question with regard to
Christian and then.
Yes, thanks for an interesting presentation. I was wondering, in a historic perspective, I mean, when the first car was developed, could you already at that time see this masculine, passionate love for the car, or is it something that has developed much more over the years?
It's definitely something which has developed much more over the years, and I think it's special. Who wrote about that? But anyway, this is Victoria Scharf, is it? Victoria Scharf, who's written, it's like electric cars in the 1920s. There was this big thing about, and I was sort of the consumer group was women. Which was, so it has looked very different in and that specific kind of course, when it also comes when automobility becomes a sort of mass or technology of the masses in certain ways. So it's also it's very classed, I would say. But of course, with the T-Ford, I would say. It is, I mean, but the interesting thing that it looks quite different in different parts of the world. And when Edna Duffy, I think, Edna Duffy has written a wonderful book on speed and the first motorists. And in the handbooks for motorists in Germany and France, they said you should carry a weapon because when you go into the countryside, you can be attacked. And, you know, because the rural people hate motorists fanatically. And in a German handbook from 1910, it say, you know, you should, I mean, they warn you for going outside the cities in a car or in a motor vehicle because the rural or the people outside the cities hates vehicles fanatically. And there was so many cases of people actually being lynched go, which Edna Duffy writes about in this wonderful book, which is interesting. So it's that sort of love and passion has apparently always not been there, which is rather hate actually against motorists.
But this had good reasons.
What?
It was not just passion, but there were reasons for that. Because everybody having motivated at that time claimed to also have the right of way against everybody else.
Yeah, definitely.
And horses
Yeah.
on the same roads.
Yeah. Of course. Of course, any way you can go. I've traveled a lot in India, and of course, if you go on the highway from like Jaipur to Delhi, and the number of vehicles, the buses and cars and donkeys and even elephants sometimes who share the road is of course is enormous. I mean, it's fascinating, but it's.
Do you have some short question, Hilda, or? Because it's the last question.
With Chinese on shifting passions,
Yeah.
and how I think that's a very interesting and relevant field to go into. And then I want to return back to this Volvo model. Because Volvo is now bought by a Chinese company, right?
Yeah.
It's probably a shame for you. And then interesting discussions came up even in the Chinese press, because then the Chinese producers wanted to make it bigger and more pretentious. And the Swedish engineers, they were like, oh, we always had this underplayed elegance, what are this competition, Also, I think that were also masculinity implied in this, because, I mean, this underplayed, non-pretentious cars or whatever lifestyles is not really popular in China, where cars are pioneering. And I also visited a showroom for Volvo cars in Beijing, and then it was a woman, a salesperson, and she was very energetic and told us a lot about these wonderful cars and that they have special customers. But then we asked her, what would you like to drive yourself? And she said, a BMW.
Okay.
Thank you again.
Tack så
Thank you very
mycket.
much.